The nurse was fired for theft, and the hospital director asked him one question. His answer made her fall to her knees. Nathan Edwards had always prided himself on his work. As a nurse at St. Helena Hospital in the heart of New York City, his job wasn't just a way to pay the bills. It was his calling. He thrived on the fast pace of the ER, the challenges of critical care, and the moments when he could make a real difference in someone's life. To his patients, Nathan was a steady hand in the chaos. To his colleagues, he was a trusted friend. But in a single afternoon, his world came crashing down. "Nathan, can you step into my office?" The voice of Margaret Sinclair, the hospital's director, was calm but carried an edge of authority that left no room for negotiation. It wasn't unusual to be called into Margaret's office. Nathan had been there before to discuss patient care initiatives and staffing issues. But today felt different. There was something in the clipped tone of her voice, the way her assistant avoided eye contact as Nathan walked past her desk, that set him on edge. As he entered the room, Margaret gestured for him to sit. Her office was starkly professional. Shelves lined with medical journals, a framed photograph of her with city officials, and her pristine desk, where a manila folder sat ominously. "Nathan," she began, leaning forward slightly, her sharp blue eyes locking onto his, "I need to discuss something serious with you." Nathan shifted in his seat. "Of course," he replied, his tone cautious but respectful. Margaret opened the folder and slid a set of documents across the desk toward him. "We've uncovered some troubling discrepancies," she said, her voice steady but tinged with disappointment. Nathan looked down. His name was scrawled across the top of the first page, beneath a series of timestamps and inventory logs. Attached were grainy stills from security footage showing a figure in scrubs, someone who looked unmistakably like him, entering the medication storage area late at night. "These records," Margaret continued, her tone cool, "show that controlled substances have gone missing during your shifts. The security footage places you near the storage room at suspicious times." Nathan's pulse quickened as he stared at the documents. His initial confusion turned to alarm. "This can't be right," he said, shaking his head. "I don't steal. I've never—" "I'd like to believe you," Margaret interrupted, her voice softening momentarily, "but the evidence is difficult to ignore. The medications that disappeared are highly regulated, Nathan. This isn't just a hospital policy issue. It's a legal one." He sat back, the weight of her words sinking in. "I don't know what to say," he managed. "Someone's framing me. That's the only explanation. I've never accessed that storage area outside my regular duties." Margaret's expression remained unreadable. "I wish there were another explanation," she said. "But until we can investigate further, I have no choice but to place you on suspension. Effective immediately." The words hit Nathan like a physical blow. His career, his livelihood, his reputation, all of it was being ripped away based on false accusations. "Margaret, please," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I've dedicated my life to this job. You know me. I would never—" "I'm sorry," she said, cutting him off with a firmness that signaled the discussion was over. "Security will escort you out." The next few minutes passed in a blur. 2 security guards appeared at the door, their presence making it clear that there was no room for argument. As they walked him through the hospital, Nathan felt the weight of every gaze from his colleagues. He heard the whispers as he passed. "That's him," someone murmured. "I can't believe it," said another. Nurses and doctors he had worked alongside for years averted their eyes, their faces a mixture of shock and pity. By the time Nathan reached the hospital's front entrance, the humiliation had become unbearable. He stood outside in the cold November air, his mind racing. How had this happened? Who could possibly want to ruin him like this? Nathan sat down heavily on a bench near the entrance, staring at the bustling city streets but seeing nothing. His thoughts replayed Margaret's words, the damning evidence she'd shown him, the look in her eyes as she delivered the suspension. A mix of emotions swirled inside him. Anger, confusion, betrayal. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to breathe. This wasn't over. Whoever had orchestrated this was clever, but they weren't infallible. "I didn't do this," he muttered to himself, the cold biting his skin. "And I'm going to prove it." His resolve hardened as he sat there. He couldn't let this accusation destroy everything he had worked for. Someone wanted him gone, and he would find out who and why. Nathan's apartment felt colder than usual as he sat at his kitchen table, the documents from Margaret's office spread out before him. The dim light above flickered, casting shadows across the pages, but Nathan hardly noticed. He had read through them at least 10 times, hoping to find something, anything that could prove his innocence. The surveillance footage was the most damning. The grainy images showed a figure in scrubs entering the medication storage room late at night. The posture, the build, the way the person moved. It looked like him. But Nathan knew it wasn't. A knock at the door startled him. He stood, his muscles tense, before realizing it was only his sister, Emily. She entered without waiting for an invitation, a lawyer's confidence in her stride. "You look awful," she said, tossing her coat onto a chair. "Thanks," Nathan replied dryly. "That's exactly what I needed to hear right now." Emily ignored his sarcasm and sat across from him. She was a defense attorney, sharp and methodical, and Nathan had called her the moment he left the hospital. If anyone could help him, it was her. She picked up the surveillance stills, studying them closely. "It's not exactly a smoking gun," she said, her voice measured. "The footage is low quality, and the timestamps aren't even visible in these prints. But they're enough to get me suspended," Nathan said bitterly. Emily leaned back in her chair. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning." For the next hour, Nathan recounted every detail of the past few weeks, his shifts, the medications he'd handled, the moments that seemed routine but now felt suspicious in hindsight. He also mentioned the odd looks he'd received from Richard, the hospital security technician, in the days leading up to the accusation. "It feels like someone's been watching me," Nathan said. "Setting me up." Emily tapped her pen against the table, her brow furrowed. "Framing someone takes effort," she said. "Who would go to this much trouble? And why you?" Nathan hesitated. He thought about his colleagues, his supervisors, even the hospital director. But no one stood out as an obvious suspect. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've never had problems with anyone. At least, not that I'm aware of." Emily nodded slowly. "Then we start with the evidence. The footage, the inventory records, the signatures. If someone's framing you, they had to leave a trail. And if they didn't, we'll make one appear." Her confidence was reassuring, but Nathan still felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His career was on the line. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Margaret Sinclair sat in her office, staring at the same folder she had shown Nathan. She had reviewed the evidence twice since his suspension, and while it seemed convincing, something about it nagged at her. Margaret prided herself on her ability to read people, and Nathan's reaction during their meeting didn't match the profile of a thief. He hadn't been defensive or angry. He had been confused, almost desperate. "Maybe I'm getting soft," she muttered to herself, shaking her head. Her assistant, Helen, knocked softly on the door and entered with a clipboard. "You asked for a review of the medication logs," Helen said, setting the papers down on Margaret's desk. Margaret glanced through them. The missing drugs were all high-value medications, opioids primarily, taken in small but noticeable quantities over several weeks. "Who flagged this in the first place?" Margaret asked. Helen hesitated. "It was an anonymous report," she said. "Security sent the initial footage after that." Margaret frowned. "Anonymous?" "Yes," Helen confirmed. "No name, no details. Just a note saying we should check Nathan Edwards' shifts." Margaret's unease grew. Anonymous tips could be legitimate, but they could just as easily be malicious. And if someone had a reason to target Nathan, this would be the perfect way to do it. The more she thought about it, the less certain she felt about the case. Her instincts told her to dig deeper, and Margaret always trusted her instincts. Later that evening, she called Lucas Carter, a private investigator she had worked with in the past. Lucas was thorough, discreet, and relentless when it came to uncovering the truth. "I need you to look into a situation at the hospital," Margaret told him. "There's a nurse, Nathan Edwards, who's been accused of theft. I want to make sure we have the right person." Lucas didn't ask why she doubted the case. He simply said, "Send me what you have, and I'll get started." At the same time, Nathan and Emily began their own investigation. They started with the surveillance footage, which Emily obtained from the hospital through a formal request. Watching it on her laptop, Emily noticed something odd. The figure in the video moved stiffly, as if they were deliberately exaggerating their posture. "This doesn't look natural," she said, pausing the video. "It's like they're trying to mimic the way you walk." Nathan stared at the screen. The figure's movements did seem off, but it wasn't enough to prove anything. "Can we track where they came from?" he asked. Emily shook her head. "The footage starts when they're already in the hallway." "Convenient, isn't it?" Nathan's frustration boiled over. Whoever did this planned everything. They knew how to make it look real. Emily placed a hand on his shoulder. Then we'll plan better, she said. If they made a mistake, we'll find it. And if they didn't, we'll make them slip. Nathan paced the length of his small apartment, the tension in his chest building with every passing second. It had been 3 days since his suspension, and the whispers of betrayal still echoed in his mind. The documents Emily had reviewed pointed to a carefully orchestrated plan. Someone inside the hospital wanted him out. But who? And why? Emily's voice interrupted his thoughts. I've been looking into the signatures, she said, scrolling through her laptop. The inventory records were signed electronically, which makes forgery easier. I've sent them to a handwriting expert, but it'll take a few days to hear back. Nathan nodded, though he felt no relief. Even if the signatures don't match, that doesn't prove who's behind it, he said. We need something concrete. Emily leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against the table. You said you noticed Richard, the security technician, acting strange recently. Maybe he knows something. Nathan hesitated. Richard had always been friendly but reserved, someone who preferred to stay in the background. Lately, though, Nathan had noticed the man avoiding his gaze and acting unusually nervous. I'll talk to him, Nathan said finally. The following afternoon, Nathan waited near the hospital parking lot, where he knew Richard often took his smoke breaks. Dressed in casual clothes to avoid drawing attention, Nathan kept his distance until Richard appeared, lighting a cigarette with shaky hands. Richard, Nathan called, stepping into the man's line of sight. Richard flinched, his eyes widening as he saw Nathan approach. What are you doing here? He asked, glancing around nervously. I need to talk to you, Nathan said, his voice firm but calm. I know something's not right with this whole situation, and I think you do too. Richard looked away, his jaw tightening. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do, Nathan pressed. You've been avoiding me for weeks, and now I'm being accused of theft. If you know something, you need to tell me. Richard's hand trembled as he raised the cigarette to his lips. You don't understand, he said after a long pause. It's not that simple. Nathan stepped closer, lowering his voice. They're trying to destroy my life, Richard. I could lose everything. Please, if you know anything, I need to hear it. For a moment, it seemed as though Richard would refuse. Then he sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping. Fine, he muttered. But not here. In the dimly lit corner of a nearby coffee shop, Richard spoke in hushed tones, his eyes darting toward the door every few seconds. I was approached about a month ago, he began. David Sinclair came to me with a proposition. He wanted me to adjust the surveillance cameras in the medication storage area, change the angles, make sure they didn't capture certain parts of the room. Nathan's stomach turned. David Sinclair, Margaret's husband and the hospital's administrator, was a man known for his sharp business acumen and commanding presence. Nathan had always found him cold and calculating, but he had never imagined David would stoop to sabotage. Why would he do that? Nathan asked. Richard hesitated, as if weighing whether to continue. He said it was for an internal investigation, he explained. Something about catching employees breaking the rules. But then he told me to send the footage directly to him, no one else. Nathan's fists clenched under the table. And you didn't think that was suspicious? Of course I did. Richard snapped. But David's the administrator. He could fire me with a snap of his fingers. I didn't have a choice. Nathan leaned forward, his voice low but intense. Did you see him alter the footage? Or plant the evidence? Richard shook his head. No, but I know he's the one who flagged you. The anonymous report about you. It came from his office. Nathan sat back, his mind racing. If Richard was telling the truth, David had orchestrated the entire scheme. But why? What could he possibly gain from targeting a nurse? At the same time, Lucas Carter's investigation was uncovering similar threads. In Margaret's office, he presented his findings with characteristic bluntness. Your husband's name keeps coming up, Lucas said, laying out a series of documents. He's been moving large amounts of money through untraceable accounts, far more than his salary could explain. Margaret's heart sank. Are you saying David is stealing from the hospital? Not directly, Lucas replied. But I believe he's involved in a black market operation. Selling stolen medications. Margaret stared at the documents, disbelief warring with anger. David had always been ambitious, but she never suspected he was capable of something so heinous. And Nathan, she asked, how does he fit into this? Lucas folded his arms. Nathan's just a scapegoat. Your husband needed someone to take the fall, and Nathan was an easy target, well-respected, visible, and in the perfect position to be blamed. Margaret's chest tightened as guilt flooded her. She had suspended an innocent man, someone she now realized had been framed from the start. "Find me proof," she said, her voice trembling with resolve. "Whatever it takes, I want the truth." Meanwhile, Nathan left the coffee shop with a renewed sense of purpose. Richard's confession wasn't enough to clear his name, but it was a start. He knew he was up against a powerful enemy, one who wouldn't hesitate to destroy him if he got too close to the truth. But Nathan wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Nathan didn't have to wait long to confirm his suspicions. The conversation with Richard had given him a name, David Sinclair, and now it was time to confront the man directly. It wasn't a plan he relished, but Nathan knew that sitting back and waiting for justice wasn't an option. That evening, Nathan lingered outside the hospital, watching as David exited the administrative wing. Dressed impeccably in a tailored coat, David looked every bit the untouchable authority figure, but Nathan saw him for what he truly was. "David," Nathan called out, stepping into the glow of the parking lot lights. David paused, his expression tightening when he saw Nathan. "What are you doing here?" "You're suspended." "I'm here for answers," Nathan said, his voice steady but laced with anger. "I know you're behind the accusations against me. I know you've been setting me up." David's mouth twitched in a semblance of a smirk. "You're making baseless accusations. I suggest you leave before you make things worse for yourself." Nathan took a step closer. "You've been stealing from a hospital, selling medications on the black market, and you needed someone to take the fall. That's why you targeted me." For a brief moment, David's eyes narrowed, his polished demeanor slipping. But he recovered quickly, shaking his head in mock amusement. "You have no proof," he said coldly. "And if you keep this up, I'll make sure you never work in healthcare again." The threat hung heavy in the air, but Nathan didn't flinch. "I'll find a proof," he said firmly. "And when I do, you'll answer for everything you've done." David didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked toward his car, leaving Nathan standing alone in the biting cold. At the same time, Lucas Carter was piecing together the final elements of his investigation. Working late into the night, the private investigator cross-referenced financial transactions tied to the hospital's accounts. The patterns were clear. David Sinclair was laundering money through dummy corporations, all tied to illegal pharmaceutical sales. Lucas didn't waste time. By morning, he presented his findings to Margaret in her office. "This goes beyond theft," Lucas said, placing the documents on her desk. "Your husband is running a criminal operation, and Nathan is the scapegoat." Margaret stared at the papers, her heart sinking. The evidence was overwhelming, leaving no room for doubt. "How could he do this?" she murmured, more to herself than to Lucas. Lucas studied her carefully. "What do you want to do about it?" Margaret's jaw tightened. "I want to stop him," she said. "And I want to make this right with Nathan." Her voice wavered slightly, but her determination was unmistakable. Later that day, Margaret called David to her office. The confrontation was inevitable, and she needed answers before taking action. David entered with his usual air of authority, but Margaret's cold gaze unsettled him. "What's this about?" he asked, sitting down across from her desk. "I know everything," Margaret said sharply, sliding Lucas's report toward him. "The stolen medications, the money laundering, the lies. And I know you framed Nathan to cover your tracks." David's face paled, but he quickly recovered, his tone defensive. "This is ridiculous. You can't prove any of it." "Don't lie to me, David," Margaret snapped. "I've already hired someone to gather evidence. It's over." For a moment, David remained silent, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. Then his expression twisted into something darker. "You want to destroy me," he said quietly. "Go ahead, but you'll regret it." Margaret held her ground, though her hands trembled beneath the desk. "You've destroyed enough already. It ends now." As David stormed out of her office, Margaret felt a mix of anger and grief. She had once trusted this man, built a life and career alongside him. But now she had to face the truth. The person she thought she knew was gone. And Nathan, an innocent man, had paid the price for her blindness. Margaret sat alone in her office, the weight of recent revelations pressing down on her like a physical burden. The man she had shared her life with was at the center of a criminal operation. Worse, she had blindly acted on his orchestrated lies, suspending Nathan, an innocent man, without a second thought. But something else was gnawing at her. Lucas's investigation had uncovered financial schemes and forged evidence, but there was one detail buried in the pile of paperwork that Margaret couldn't ignore. It was a small anomaly, seemingly insignificant at first. Nathan's birth records didn't match the information listed in his hospital employment file. Driven by an unshakable curiosity, Margaret reached out to Lucas that evening. "I need you to run a background check on Nathan Edwards," she said, her voice tight with unease. Lucas hesitated. "Isn't he the victim here?" "He is," Margaret admitted. "But there's something about his file that doesn't add up. Just look into it." Meanwhile, Nathan returned to his apartment, emotionally drained from his confrontation with David. As he stepped inside, Emily was waiting for him, her laptop open and a determined look on her face. "I've been digging," she said without preamble. "The anonymous report against you didn't come from a random source. It was flagged from David Sinclair's office computer." Nathan wasn't surprised. "That confirms what Richard told me," he said. "But we still don't have enough to take him down." Emily's gaze softened. "You're doing everything you can, Nathan. But this isn't just about proving your innocence anymore. It's about exposing the whole system he's built." Her words lingered in his mind long after she left. Nathan didn't just want his job back, he wanted justice. 2 days later, Lucas called Margaret with the results of his research. His voice, usually measured and calm, carried an edge of urgency. "You're going to want to sit down for this," he said. Margaret braced herself as Lucas explained what he'd uncovered. Decades ago, during her early years in medical school, Margaret had been pressured by her conservative family to give up a child for adoption. The decision had haunted her ever since, though she had buried the memory deep. "Nathan Edwards is that child," Lucas said bluntly. "Your son." Margaret's world spun. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she thought she might faint. "That's not possible," she whispered. "I've cross-checked everything," Lucas said. "His birth records, adoption papers, and DNA markers from hospital records. It all matches." Tears streamed down Margaret's face as the weight of the truth settled over her. The nurse she had accused and suspended was the child she had lost. Later that evening, Margaret sat in her home office, staring at a faded photograph of herself as a young woman. The years had hardened her, turning her into a no-nonsense leader who prided herself on making tough decisions. But now she realized how blind she had been, not just to David's schemes, but to the pain she had caused Nathan. She picked up the phone and dialed Lucas. "Set up a meeting with Nathan," she said quietly. "I need to talk to him." Nathan arrived at Margaret's office the next morning, uncertain of what to expect. Her tone over the phone had been uncharacteristically gentle, almost pleading. "Thank you for coming," Margaret said as he stepped inside. She motioned for him to sit, her hands clasped tightly on the desk in front of her. "I owe you an apology," she began, her voice trembling. "I failed you, Nathan. I should have seen through the lies. But there's more I need to tell you." Nathan frowned, his guard immediately going up. "What is this about?" Margaret took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his with a vulnerability he had never seen before. "Nathan, I recently discovered something that changes everything. You're my son." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Nathan blinked, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. "What?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was forced to give you up for adoption when I was young," Margaret continued, her voice cracking. "I never thought I'd see you again. I had no idea you were here working at this hospital, right under my nose." Nathan's first reaction was disbelief, followed quickly by anger. "And you're just telling me this now, after everything that's happened?" "I didn't know," Margaret said desperately. "Not until recently. I swear if I had known." "But you didn't," Nathan interrupted, his voice rising. "You accused me. You believed I was a thief without even giving me a chance to defend myself." Margaret's tears flowed freely now. "You have every right to be angry," she said. "But please believe me when I say that I want to make things right. Not just because of what I owe you as my son, but because of what I owe you as a human being." Nathan stood, his emotions in turmoil. "I need time to process this," he said quietly, turning toward the door. Margaret didn't stop him. She simply nodded, her heart breaking as the door closed behind him. Nathan left Margaret's office reeling. Her revelation that she was his mother was almost too much to process. But one thing was clear: David Sinclair, the man who had framed him, needed to face justice. At the hospital, Margaret wrestled with her next steps. Lucas's investigation had laid everything bare. David was stealing medications and laundering money through fake companies, using Nathan as a scapegoat. The proof was overwhelming. Margaret sat at her desk, staring at the evidence, when David entered. He froze, noticing the stack of documents. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone guarded. Margaret's voice was icy. "It's over, David. I know what you've done, stealing from the hospital, selling medications, and framing Nathan. I have the evidence, and I'm turning it over to the authorities." David's face darkened, his calm demeanor cracking. "You can't prove anything," he snapped. Margaret stood, her gaze unwavering. "I already have," she said. "I've informed the board, and the police will be here shortly. It's over." David's smirk vanished. "If I go down, I'll make sure you regret it," he hissed, his voice low. "Do what you have to," Margaret replied. "I'm done protecting you." Fuming, David stormed out of her office, leaving Margaret shaken but resolute. The next morning, Nathan received a call from Emily. "Margaret reported David to the police," she said. "It's happening." Later that day, Nathan watched as officers escorted David out of the hospital in handcuffs. The staff whispered, stunned by the scandal. Margaret stood by her office window, watching the man she once trusted being taken away. David's crimes made headlines, exposing a years-long scheme of stolen medications and financial fraud. The accusations against Nathan were cleared, and he was reinstated at the hospital. Though his name was cleared, Nathan struggled to shake the emotional toll of what had happened. His colleagues apologized, but the damage to his trust lingered. A few days later, Margaret approached Nathan as he finished a shift. She looked vulnerable, far from the commanding presence he was used to. "Nathan," she said softly, "I owe you an apology. I failed you as a leader and as a mother." Nathan stiffened. The words still felt foreign. "I don't know if I can forgive you for everything," he said. Margaret nodded, her voice trembling. "I understand, but I want to try. If there's any way to fix this, I'm willing to do it." Nathan hesitated. "It's going to take time," he said finally. Margaret's lips trembled into a small, hopeful smile. "I'll wait as long as it takes." As Nathan walked away, Margaret felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but she was determined to earn back his trust, one step at a time. Nathan tried to focus on his work after being reinstated, but it wasn't easy. Returning to St. Helena Hospital felt like stepping into a room full of ghosts. Colleagues who had once admired him now approached with apologies or awkward silences, unsure of how to repair the trust they had broken. Margaret, however, didn't shy away. She began taking deliberate steps to rebuild their relationship, starting with small gestures. She reinstated Nathan's seniority, publicly acknowledged her mistakes in staff meeting, and made it clear that anyone involved in spreading rumors about him would face consequences. Despite her efforts, Nathan kept his guard up. Trust didn't come easily after everything he had endured. One evening, Margaret called Nathan and asked if they could meet outside the hospital. Reluctantly, he agreed. They met at a quiet cafe, away from the bustling streets of New York. "Thank you for coming," Margaret said, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup. She looked nervous, a side of her Nathan hadn't seen before. "I almost didn't," Nathan admitted. Margaret nodded, acknowledging his honesty. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. Not yet," she said. "But I want to explain myself, everything." Nathan listened in silence as Margaret shared the story of her past. She told him about the family pressure, the shame she had felt as a young medical student, and the pain of giving him up for adoption. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said, her voice trembling. "But it was the hardest decision of my life. And not a day went by that I didn't wonder where you were, who you'd become." Nathan felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Anger, sympathy, and sadness swirled together, leaving him unsure of how to respond. "It doesn't erase what you did to me," he said finally, his tone measured. "But I believe you're telling the truth." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I am," she said, "and I'm so sorry for everything, for failing you then and now." Nathan nodded, still unsure of what their future might hold, but willing to give her the chance to make amends. Over the following weeks, Margaret made good on her promise. She spent time with Nathan outside of work, learning about his life, his interests, and his struggles. It was a slow process, but gradually, the walls between them began to crumble. For Nathan, the healing wasn't just about Margaret. It was about reclaiming his sense of purpose. He threw himself into his work, finding solace in the gratitude of his patients and the camaraderie of those who had supported him through the ordeal. One afternoon, Margaret joined Nathan during a volunteer shift at a community health clinic. Watching him interact with patients, she couldn't help but feel proud. He was everything she had hoped he would become: compassionate, skilled, and resilient. As they left the clinic, Margaret turned to him. "Nathan," she said hesitantly, "I just want you to know how proud I am of the man you've become. Despite everything, you've built a life that inspires people." Nathan looked at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. For the first time, he felt a flicker of acceptance, not just of her apology, but of the possibility of a real connection. "Thank you," he said quietly. Months passed, and though the pain of the past hadn't completely faded, Nathan and Margaret had begun to rebuild their relationship. What started as tentative conversations grew into a steady bond. For Nathan, accepting Margaret as his mother didn't come easily, but her consistent efforts to show she cared slowly chipped away at his reservations. At the hospital, Nathan reclaimed his role with confidence. He found solace in the rhythm of patient care and the support of his colleagues, many of whom went out of their way to make amends. Though forgiveness wasn't instant, Nathan learned to move forward without letting bitterness define him. One evening, Margaret invited Nathan to her home for dinner. It was a quiet, unassuming gesture, but one that carried immense significance. Nathan arrived with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Margaret greeted him warmly, leading him to the dining room where a simple but thoughtful meal was set. "I wasn't sure what you'd like," Margaret admitted with a nervous smile, "so I kept it safe." Nathan chuckled, the tension easing slightly. "This is great," he said. Over the meal, they talked, not about the hospital or the events that had brought them to this point, but about their lives. Margaret shared stories from her early career, and Nathan opened up about his childhood and the challenges of growing up in foster care before being adopted. "I've always wondered what my biological parents were like," Nathan said at one point. "But I never imagined meeting you under circumstances like this." Margaret lowered her gaze. "I never imagined I'd get the chance to meet you at all," she said softly. "I know I can't change the past, but I want to be here for you now, in whatever way you'll let me." Nathan nodded, his heart softening. "We'll figure it out," he said simply. As the months turned into a year, Margaret and Nathan continued to build their relationship. They celebrated milestones together: Nathan's promotion to a leadership role in the nursing staff, Margaret's decision to step down as hospital director to focus on mentorship, and even small victories like volunteering together at community health events. For Nathan, the journey wasn't just about finding closure. It was about reclaiming his sense of identity. The trials he had faced, the false accusations, the betrayal, the revelations, had shaped him but didn't define him. One evening, as they sat on a park bench after a long day, Margaret turned to Nathan. "You know," she said, her voice light but sincere, "you've taught me more about strength than I ever thought possible." Nathan smiled, looking out at the city skyline. "And you've taught me that sometimes people deserve a second chance." Margaret's eyes misted as she reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. In that quiet moment, amidst the hum of the city, they both felt a sense of peace they hadn't known before. Their journey hadn't been easy, but it had brought them to a place of understanding, forgiveness, and the promise of a new beginning.